Mr Hooper, Mrs Kane, Ms Edge and Mr Skelly, so hopefully we'll be able to get them all in. Mr Hooper, you're welcome.
So you've all talked quite extensively about how important scrutiny is and how you've all got the necessary skills. So I'd like to ask each of you to demonstrate that by talking about one Isle-of-Man government policy that you maybe take issue with or disagree with, and why. And please don't all pick the same policy.
Right, well, first up, Mrs Poole-Wilson.
This isn't, if we look at the budget last week, I voted in favour of the budget last week, but I am very mindful, and I think the budget was the right budget for the time we're in. I'm very mindful that when we start thinking about an inclusive and caring society, and a number of people who are already out of the tax bracket may not necessarily have seen any particular benefit to them at that point. I'm also mindful that whilst increases have been given around pensions and child benefit and so on, it's very, very difficult for people to keep pace with the cost of living when people are on fixed incomes. I think the difficulty is you can sit at this point and say, oh, wouldn't it be great if we could do more? The difficulty and my perspective and why I voted in support for the budget and think it is the right thing to do is that at this point we haven't seen enough traction in terms of the good news that's happened this year in terms of increased receipts, lower welfare payments and so on. What I would like to see is that if we see that consecutively, if we see that sort of traction and that development, I would absolutely like to make sure that we are thinking creatively about how we make sure that the benefits are felt at the lower end. And I thought Mr Robertshaw's question, I think he might have gone, but I think Mr Robertshaw's question about national insurance and the thresholds for where people start paying national insurance was was one example of something that we should look more at.
Mrs Chambers.
Again, with my third sector hat on, I think it's probably, I would take issue with the lack of transparency amongst the third sector, the lack of a charity commission, and I know that there's being some work done by the AG's office to bring through some legislation that will mean that charities have to publish their accounts at the end of each year, and so that will become a more transparent process. But I think there's an awful lot of work to be done, both to recognise the importance of the vast amount of money that's raised on Ireland by the third sector and the support that they can give government departments, and but also there are third sector organisations that fall way short of what they should be achieving, and we need to be looking at that. It's a huge area, and I think it's a really important one.
Councillor Skinner.
It's a difficult one, really. I know that there's a public consultation at the moment with regard to public sector housing, and speaking to people outside, that there are a number of issues there with regards to sales and what you can earn, and that there are possibly people who are living in houses who have local authority houses but live elsewhere within on the globe, and I think it's things like that as well that need digging into a bit more so that doesn't happen.
Thank you. Mr Ramsay.
Yes, my example of scrutinising is in relation to the programme for government. The initial programme for government document included what I thought was a very important policy commitment to improve the availability and standard of preschool education. Now, when you read through to the delivering the programme for government document, the availability bit had fallen off, so the read through was broken basically. So when you got to the delivery document, it referred only to a regulatory framework and updating the education bill as a kind of consolidation exercise, and that very important commitment to improve the availability had disappeared. Now, I'm sure the work was still going on, but as a document that was not satisfactory really, and I think there were quite a few areas. I think because the programme for government was put together so quickly and it was a very good piece of work, that there was quite a lot of wonky bits that could have been looked at again, I think.
Thank you. Ms Hendy.
The matter of care in the community has been in place for a long time, and there are policies out there, there are regulations out there, But my experience has been that care in the community is a great philosophy, but the resources are not in place, and I think it's just not it's not been scrutinised properly, and I think there are great gaps in the delivery of that service, which is leading to people being alone in their homes for long periods of time. And it's we have this issue with older people being almost like allegedly the forgotten part of our community, and care in the community, I think, has played a large part in that. So again, the scrutiny of the legislation that took that forward and the policy probably wasn't enough to make sure that it was taken forward in the full and comprehensive way that was envisaged at the time. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Hardy.
Again, looking, say, the budget, I think the raising of the EPA allowance, I think, is inherently good thing. I think it brings more people back into work. It makes sure that children are effectively given the best start possible. But from an operational point of view, because I have a vested interest with the nursery, looking at a situation whereby EPA is not actually paid to the childcare provider, I think there is a facility there whereby fundamentally it's open to abuse. I think that the same almost with rent. I think that the rent should be I think that the process is correct in terms of we're trying to assist people so that they can better their lives, but I think that the actual methods used in terms of how that money is paid to the people who it should be paid to, in terms of rent and EPA and so on and so forth, I think it's open to abuse. I think it needs to be tightened up a little bit with regards to making sure it goes for the intended purpose that government has actually earmarked that funds for. So I think, looking at it from a pragmatic point of view, you need to make sure that, like the preschool credit is given to get people back into, to make sure that children effectively get the best start, but it is paid to the nursery, ergo that preschool credit is used for education. I think the same should be true for employed persons allowance and so on and so forth.
Thank you. Mr. Cartledge.
Thank you. I don't believe scrutiny should necessarily mean that you disagree with something, but one of the things that I would like to see, which currently doesn't happen, is that elements of the budget can be voted on separately, as opposed to a collective one, which only allows members to accept. Sorry, Mr. Chambers. Only allows members to accept or reject.
Mrs. Sharpe.
For me, it would be the safeguarding bill, which I do applaud because it puts the safeguarding of looked after children and vulnerable adults on a statutory level for the first time. What I have a problem with is it refers to vulnerable adults as adults in certain categories, that is over 18, people who are living in residential care, people who are perhaps receiving counselling, etc. Personally, I would like to see all children who have been looked after in the past being regarded as vulnerable adults, because from my interviews that I've carried out over the last 4 years, these adults have always got that looked after child inside of them, and it means that they go on into life and they make perhaps poor decisions in relationships. They have a lot more problems than your average person to deal with. And I've noticed in my research that we're now up to the 4th or the 5th generation of Manx children who are being looked after. The parents were looked after, their grandparents were looked after, all in the Isle of Man, because this cycle has never been broken. And I do think that the government has been failing people in this regard, and that once they're 18, that's it. The government can wash their hands off them, if you like. Also, I was listening to the Social Policy Review Committee meeting recently where they interviewed Anne Seed from St Christopher's, and she was talking about the age 16 to 17 gap, so that if people who have been looked after leave their residential care, there's nothing in law to mean that the Isle of Man government has to look after those people. They're only looked after by a wraparound service which St Christopher's provides. Now, what happens if St Christopher's is no longer able to provide that?
Sorry, I have to cut you off at that point. Thank you.